Today we're going to talk about something where if you know about it, man, the world's your oyster. But if you don't know about it, you are going to be blindsided. The future is going to be unkind. This is one of these things where if you know, you know, and if you don't know, you're screwed. Hello, everyone. Dr. Chris Martenson of Peak Prosperity here, back with you. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my old subjects, my favorite subjects, peak oil. It's back. Hey, it's a concept that says, you know, oil goes up, oil goes down. It's a finite resource, but we've been deluding ourselves in this country for a long time. Now, we just saw the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, comes out and says, hey, you know what? Shale could, well, hold on a second. Let me get my little... let's see. How about a pen? Yeah, shale oil could boost production even at $50 per barrel. No, it can't. It just absolutely can't. And here's why. So let's go into that. This big thing just happened this week. So you see the date down there, and I'll get my highlighter so that we can all follow along together. March 13th. Today being the 14th. So this just came out in Bloomberg yesterday at the time of this recording. And CIRA is this huge gathering of industry insiders. The headline is Specter of Peak Oil Production Looms Once Again. Pro tip, it never actually went anywhere. It just took a little bit of a hiatus, and we're going to talk about that hiatus. Now, remember, it was so just December 2024 when we were getting headlines in Forbes like this: U.S. energy dominance continues. Another annual oil production record, a testament to resilience and innovation. It is, and it doesn't change the dynamic that oil is a finite resource. Geological limits are real. If you understand this, you understand where the future is going. If you don't understand this, it is going to be a big wet blanket on most of your hopes and dreams. This is a really important topic. Now, for those of you who don't believe in this, just turn this off right now, tune out. This isn't about beliefs. This is about the data, and it's about logic, and it's about making sense of the world as it actually is, not as we wish it to be. So from that Bloomberg article, they said here, this is their opening 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, quote, "The topic of peak oil production is back in vogue." Never left vogue for me. After a prolonged hiatus, if remarks from executives attending the key energy conference in Houston this week are any indication. The idea that global petroleum production would be on the cusp of a downhill slide was all the rage at industry events, environmental conferences, and an academic debates during the first decade of the century. But as the shale oil boom took off in places like North Dakota and then Texas, those worries vanished as a point of conversation. And we saw charts like this. You see these in particular, Reddit will throw things up, but the EIA, even the Energy Information Agency, puts charts out like this. Get my laser pointer. Look, this was the peak of production in 1970. Led to all kinds of giant, monstrous errors. And then this little bump right here, that little bump, that's Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. But then it was coming down, and look, peak oil is off the menu, folks, right? And they just put it like this. This is a chart crime to just, even squeeze it like, oh my gosh, look, that means that it could just keep doing that forever, right? It's going to keep going up forever. The answer is no, it won't. First, we get our first insight by looking at oil. If we decompose it into conventional oil, where you drill a hole straight in the ground and there's oil under pressure in a sort of a pooled form down there, not quite, but close enough for this work. And also the blue and the yellow, the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska, both of those are very conventional types of oil, one offshore, one onshore. Okay, there was a peak in 1970. Notice the first thing we're going to notice. None of these things, no matter how much drilling we've done, has conventional oil come back and hit a new peak. We did get to a new peak because we brought on this red stuff. That's tight oil. Tight oil, too, is limited. We figured out how to unlock what's called the parent rocks in this geological structure. The parent rocks are the ones that hold sort of like the loose molecules in a sort of a slate-like aggregate, but once you've drilled those, there are no grandparent rocks in the story. That's it. You were drilling the source rocks. We figured out how to unlock it. Super awesome. Less awesome was we didn't figure out that those two would run out, and we told ourselves story like energy dominance, like Forbes was just saying, right? So carrying on with that Bloomberg article, folks, this is so important. This is really important. Those with ears to hear, listen, your ears are going to perk right up. Your eyes are going to open. If you can see this for what it is, this is explaining the beginning of the end of U.S. energy dominance in oil. That means we're going to have to start winding down that part of the project, but we're going to have to start winding up other parts of this project. This is one of the two things, one of the biggest investment risks out there and one of the biggest investment opportunities out there if you know where the puck is going in this story. Carrying on, quote, some of the biggest voices in the shale patch are now talking about it. Peak oil in this year at Zero Week by S&P Global. It's coming up because the top tier of crude targets is largely exhausted after roughly 15 years of intensive drilling. People, 15 years is a snap of my fingers. It's just such a tiny geological piece of time. 15 years. It was a good 15 years. But what? Kind of over now? This is amazing. The next 15 years, everything just changed, okay? Not because we have new data. We've had this data the whole time. We always knew that the amount of drillable acres was a finite number. We always knew that finite numbers have an ending point when you're drilling through them at a pace. We always knew that. What's going to change here is the most important thing of them all, which is the narrative structure of what we're telling ourselves. It's not the data. Data doesn't change anything in 99.5% of people's minds. Data, irrelevant. What matters is the narrative. The narrative was for 15 years, peak oil is a broken concept. We don't have to worry about it. It's really far in the future. Oops. Time to change the narrative structure. And that's what you're seeing right here. This is about to become common knowledge over the next couple of years. You're getting about a 2 to 3 year head start on everybody else. Congratulations. If you like head starts, you're going to love this particular episode. Carrying on, quote, we don't have many oil plays left in this country. Scott Sheffield, one of Shale's pioneers, said in a Bloomberg TV interview, and I've got a piece from him on that in just a second. The inventory is getting worse, naturally, because we drill so many wells. You're fighting the inventory deterioration at the same time you're trying to improve efficiencies. Well, inventory is getting worse means, dude, we're running out of drillable acres. But also they drill the best acres first. They break them into tiers, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 1's the best. Almost out of that stuff. That's where you get good returns, high amounts of oil back for your effort. Tier 2, still get oil, but not quite as much for your effort. Tier 3, worse than that. That's what he's saying when the inventory is getting worse. We're moving out of tier 1, getting squeezed into tier 2. And by the way, when we talk about shale plays, there they are. Everything in colored is shale. There's a little bit more in a couple other, these are the big ones, right? You got the Bakken up there in North Dakota, a little bit in Montana. You got the Niobrara in Colorado and up into Wyoming. You got the Anadarko down here in Oklahoma. The Permian, this is the big boy right here. The Eagleford, is it oil? Is it gas? It's kind of in between. These two, Appalachia with the Appalachian play up here and the Haynesville play down here, and also the Barnett in here. These are all actually gas plays, right? So that's, the Marcellus is beautiful. I wish we had pipelines coming into Massachusetts, but my green senators won't allow the pipeline. So instead, this stuff has to be drilled, shipped all the way down to here, converted into LNG, shipped over here, briefly flag switched in Puerto Rico because of the Jones Act, and then sailed all the way up here where it's offloaded in Boston. It's the stupidest thing ever. But that's an aside. Now, carrying on from that Bloomberg article here, because it's that important, they said here, quote, Occidental Petroleum, one of the biggest shale operators, is bracing for a topping out of domestic crude production sometime in the next 5 years. I think we're going to do that in this next year and a half. ConocoPhillips CEO Ryan Lance expects nationwide oil output to plateau this decade and hold flat for an undefined period of time. As like zero more time after that. And he says it's going to be a slow decline beyond that because there's a lot of resource left to drill. Yeah, sort of, but tell you what, I've been in this oil space long enough to tell you that When the price of oil goes higher, you get more out of the ground. And when the price of oil goes down, you get less of it out of the ground. So this could get painful because if OPEC decides to open its spigots and drive the price down, it's not going to be a slow decline. It's going to be a super rapid decline in U.S. output because we can't afford to drill at 50 a barrel. It just doesn't work. And what does even a plateau for a few years look like? Remember that earlier chart I showed you where the red was tight oil? Using my very best Snagit skills, I hand scrawled in what this might look like. That's a decade-long topping process right there, more or less. And then it goes down. That's the future we're facing. This is a very, very different future from the one anybody grew up in, and it's going to be an enormous deal. Peak oil doesn't mean running out. Well, eventually it does. It means you're going after more and more expensive oil and getting less and less out of the ground. That's two exponential pressures on one thing, which is our prosperity. There's this chart right here. If it comes to pass like this, is presaging an extraordinary host of brand new winners and a whole host of brand new losers in this story. That's why I wanted you to be aware of it early and often. Can I let you in on a secret? I know of the most extraordinary community you can find on the internet, and it happens to be at Peak Prosperity. We have thousands of people dedicated to figuring out what's going on in the world, wrestling with the subjects, having completely free speech, and figuring out what we want to do about the world as we form friendships and as we average up with each other. It's an amazing place. Free-flowing ideas, great exchange, very civil. Any topic is up for discussion as long as it's related to how do we become resilient, how do we secure our wealth, how do we become better connected in the community, how are we going to develop as human beings. That has an emotional component, spiritual component, financial component, community, skills, knowledge. All of this is up for grabs. This is one of the most important times in all of history. Huge changes are afoot. Some people are going to make those changes relatively facilely. They're going to nimbly dodge into the future and be fine. Other people are going to be crushed by what's coming. The difference? Who they surround themselves with. And that's where the Peak Prosperity community can come in. I invite you to become a member, and I can't wait to meet you. So I said I'd get back to this. Pioneer Sheffield on March 11th was in an article said, hey, you really got to hunker down, he said during a Bloomberg TV interview. He said, you may have to lay off some people. So we're looking for a bust in the shale space. The busts are legendary. The booms are legendary. If you haven't watched Landman by Taylor Sheridan, you really should. It's an awesome series. Really, like everything Taylor Sheridan does. Just amazing. You've got to focus on your best prospects, he said. We'll see what happens over the next 2 or 3 years. But he expects crude prices to drop into the 50-60 range as other countries increase output while demand from China peaks out. Now, China's going to peak out because they're having economic difficulties right now, and you use more oil when you want more economy, and when your economy is smaller, you tend to use less oil. He says it's really hard to make money at $50 oil. Oh, it sure is. It is impossible, in fact, on a lot of that tier 2, tier 3 acreage. They'll tell you they can make it money at that, but they're not being honest. When you look at the all-in sustaining cost, the AISC, because you got to include everything for the company. What's the cost of all the interest and all the debt you took out when you were losing money, the 2010 to 2018? What about all the cost of acquisitions? You took that debt on the books and you have goodwill. What about the depreciation for all of your equipment that you have? What about the actual cost of all your SG&A, selling, general, and administrative in your C-suites and all of that? There are expenses. If you just look at just the well and just the drilling and just what comes out of it, sometimes you can get down to 50, but not when you're being honest. Now, what's fascinating is the Information Energy Agency, IEA, they've been talking about this peak oil demand for years. And every year they bump it a little further out into the future. They just keep bumping it out. Oh, we're going to have this peak oil demand next year. This, even though it's showing slightly less demand each year, it's showing incremental new demand every year going out to 2028 from when that chart was put together. And then we just saw recently in January of this year of 2025, the Brussels Times reported that over 1.5 million vans were registered in the EU. These are diesel vans. And as Anas Al-Haji was pointing out here, quote, Diesel engines remain the preferred choice for new van buyers in 2024. Diesel market's share rose by 1.7 percentage points to 84.5%. In contrast, electric vehicles saw a significant decrease of 9.1%, reducing their market share from 7.2 to 6.1% in 1 year. End quote. Notice the difference between 6.1% market share and 84.5% market share. So diesel's market share is going up and EVs is going down. This is not consistent with peak oil demand. We're not going to see it. For its part, Goldman Sachs doesn't see any real peak in demand until, I don't know, you got to get out to like 2035, and even then it's fairly flat. So listen, between here and 2035, for sure, we're going to see peak oil demand continue. Pro tip, it's going to continue after that as well, unless there is a supply shortage that prevents that oil from being sold because we don't have it. Other than that, guess what, people? Spoiler alert, humans like oil. We use it, and we want to use more of it next year than this year. And that's been the story for decades. I don't see anything changing that. The United States, for all the people gluing their hands to things and going on about peak oil going on about climate change and all of that, we just saw that oil demand hit a brand new peak in 2024. It looks like it's coming in hot for 2025. And so there's no peak oil demand in the U.S. yet, no demand peak. Now, I talked about all of this just a month and a half ago with Adam Rozencwajg of Gehring and Rozencwajg. Their third quarter 2024 output here, this market report they put out on title is Copper and Uranium, the Coming Divergence. That's interesting, but most importantly, I've highlighted it. They had put together something called the depletion paradox, and this is a really important story. I'm just going to repeat a tiny piece of it here today because it's that important to discuss this again. It has everything to do with peak oil. So they said here in the report, page 8, quote, consider the case of conventional U.S. crude production in the 1970s. Production peaked in November 1970 at 10 million barrels a day, with oil priced at just $3.18 a barrel, if you can imagine. At that time, the industry operated a modest 302 rigs drilling for oil. Now, the first OPEC oil crisis in 1973 sparked a response from President Nixon in the form of Project Independence, a sweeping initiative aimed at reversing the decline in U.S. output through deregulation, expedited permitting. Wow, drill, baby, drill. They called it Project Independence. Today we call it drill, baby, drill. Will it work? You need to understand this thesis because maybe not, and here's why. Much like today, optimism abounded among oil producers who believed that higher prices would unleash a drilling boom and restore U.S. production growth. They were confident they knew where to drill. All they needed was the right price signal, end quote. That is exactly 100% analogous to today. We know where all the tier 2, tier 3 acreage is. We just need a price that will unlock it. When the price of oil goes up, more comes out of the ground. When the price goes down, less comes out of the ground. That's kind of the general rule. Not so fast. So get this. This is astonishing history. Prices soared from $3.18 a barrel in 1973 to $34 a barrel by 1981. What? That's a 10, 11-fold increase. Can you imagine if oil went from $60 today to $600? Yeah, tons more would come out of the ground, of course. Producers, true to their promises, responded with vigor. The rig count climbed from 993 in 1973 to a staggering 4,500 drill rigs. Baby, we're punching holes everywhere by late 1981. Yet, despite this unprecedented surge in drilling activity, U.S. oil production steadily declined throughout the 1970s. And by the end of 1981, production had fallen to 8.5 million barrels a day, if you can imagine, far below the peak achieved a decade earlier and lower than when Nixon announced his ambitious goals. So with all of this drilling, remember this bump here is the Gulf of Mexico and it's Alaska, two giant plays that got unleashed. And despite going from 993 to 4,500 rigs, despite price going up like an enormous amount, despite finding huge finds, we still didn't achieve the old peak. That's what's going to happen with the shale space as well. To understand this better, you need to understand the entirety of the depletion paradox. It's a fairly nuanced, fairly sophisticated argument. You can find that in this podcast I did with Adam Rozencwajg. The title is Oil Peaks and Crime, The Hidden Connection Explained. And so if just to carry this on, but the EIA, our own, not to confuse it with the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency. This is the Energy Information Agency. This is under the Department of Energy. This is the U.S. part. So the EIA, normally very, very bullish. They always see more coming out of the ground for some reason. But in their own short-term energy outlook now, they are calling for U.S. production in this dark blue overall over the next year to be pretty much dead flat. Tiny bit up, but not this. This is a steep upward slope. This part here from 19 to 20 was an upward slope. This is kind of flat. Like this is like not a lot happening here from say January 24 to January 25 to January 26. That's 2 years of like, that's what a top looks like. It starts to peak out and top. Okay. So, by the way, for all of you thinking, and I know there's a few objections out there right now, like Chris, we don't need oil. We'll just shift to alternative energy. I would direct you to this amazing report. I just came across it. It came out on March 4th, 2025 from JP Morgan. It's coming from their private banking center, and this is from the chairman of market and investment strategy at JP Morgan, Michael Sembalest. Title is Heliocentrism. Objects may be further away than they appear. Here's the punchline from their abstract. After $9 trillion globally over the last decade spent on wind, solar, electric vehicles, and energy storage, electrified heat and power grids, the renewable transition is still a linear one. The renewable share of final energy consumption is slowly advancing at 0.3% to 0.6% per year. Ouch. Linear just isn't going to cut it. We do not have time for a linear transition. And this report's kind of interesting because they know, look at all these exponentially growing amounts of wind and solar and just solar up here and all of that. And, every forecast which thought it was going to go like this has been blown away. Tons and tons and tons of solar. So solar really ought to be making a lot of additions, but somehow we find it's actually only 0.3% to 0.6% per year across everything. Wind, solar, electric vehicle storage, all of it, everything is still just less than about, let's call it 0.5% per year, but it's growing exponentially. What's happening? What's happening is you can see it in the CO2 numbers right here. The world's still putting in coal and natural gas. You know why? Because they work and they're cheap. So that's where we are in this particular story. So no, alternative energy isn't going to do anything for us. Yes, the United States is hitting a flattening period right now of oil production. The oil industry executives are telling us that we are at peak at this point in time. And what we have to concern ourselves with is what happens. We're entering this period right here, which I'm showing this period. We're entering the flattening top and then decline, and we had better be ready for it because this has every implication in the world. If we don't get this right, wars get started for stuff like this. I believe this begins to explain why we're going to have to start thinking about hemispherical influences, right? It's not Canada, the U.S., Venezuela. It's kind of the three of us together trying to figure out how to supply enough hydrocarbons with, Mexico thrown into the mix for our region. This is a really big deal. This changes everything. Now that they're talking about it openly, well, that's a big deal. So at Sierra, places like Sierra. So here are my primary conclusions for today. First, peak oil. Dude, it's coming to the U.S. a little sooner than is generally understood. Because you're listening to this, you are ahead of the game. That's why I do what I do at Peak Prosperity is I help people get ahead of the game. It's the service I provide. And I've got a huge killer part 2 report for this. This for my subscribers, which you might want to check out because there's something just as magnificently, extraordinarily large as this around AI that you have to understand is coming. The shock to the system, right, is going to be, and to our national psyche, it's going to be enormous, right? Because our national psyche is landman, can do, roughneck, clever engineers. We'll unlock more. We might, but the depletion paradox says, well, we could throw ourselves at this. We could quadruple the rigs. We could have oil prices climb by a factor of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and still more may not come out of the ground. Not because we're not trying, not because we don't care, not because we don't want to, not because we're lazy, but because that's the depletion paradox. When the geology runs out on you, that's the story. This is just one of many shocks happening all at once. We have obviously economic shocks. We're going to have a debt crisis shock happening soon. I think gold and silver are starting to signal that to you for people who, again, have ears to hear. These are big, momentous times. You can't have your head in the sand, folks. You're going to have to understand the larger context. And you're going to have to make decisions on imperfect information. It's tough, but you got to do it. We're not ready for peak oil in this country, not even close. I'm disappointed that Chris Wright is out there saying something that I'm not even sure he believes. What we need is a crash program in nuclear energy, specifically small modular nuclear reactors that are very safe, can be scaled up very quickly in robotic manufacturing centers, and that could be distributed all over the place. We're going to need them. We're going to need them really bad. We need electricity. That is the lifeblood of an economy. Out of everything, if we had abundant, cheap electricity, the rest we could sort out, but we're not ready for that in the United States. Grid isn't there. Electricity production isn't there. Our nuclear program isn't there. We are not ready for this. We're not. So it's going to have market impacts. Now, you should prepare for, I think, wickedly high oil prices. What do I mean? 2, 3, 4, 500 a barrel. That's what I'm talking about. And this is coming in the next, I don't know, X number of years. And it's going to take time to adjust. But this impacts everything. It's going to distress bond markets because they're predicated on a sense of that growth is a forever thing. Peak oil is wrapping your head around the idea that now we can't grow anymore like we used to. In fact, we might experience what economists call negative growth because they don't even have a conceptual term for things doing anything other than going up and to the right. Financial instability, scarcities could result, right? And possible social unrest. At the low end of social unrest, desperate people steal things, right? So your car gets broken into, you have to start locking your house, stuff like that. At the far end, whole regions fail because they just don't have the necessary energy to support the complexity as they go through that collapse. Well, people get rowdy about that kind of stuff. And then finally, I'm predicting all of this stuff is that all these things, analytically, it's just child's play. I'm not burdened with a belief system that requires me to either be for or against peak oil on any belief way. It just is what it is. It's just numbers. Somehow my brain processes that well, and so I understand it. This is like looking at this and seeing what's coming, not hard. Just as it wasn't hard to see what was going to happen with gold, silver. And what's the conclusion to all this stuff? Hard assets. But that's another story for another day. In the meantime, check this out. This is part 2. This is for my subscribers. We've got to talk about something that just happened. It happened in January of this year of 2025. AI has jumped the shark, and unfortunately, it's not in a cage. It's out and about, and so now we're just going to have to deal with the implications. This is an extraordinary story. Something that this one really blew my mind. This for me, this is a huge story, and I'm still processing it. So we're going to talk about this with my subscribers back at Peak Prosperity. For everybody else, thank you so much for listening. Peak Oil, it's back on the menu. Wrap your mind and belief systems around it early and often because it changes everything. With that, thank you very much, and I'll see all my subscribers back at Peak Prosperity. Bye for now.